Welcome to St. Augustine College Lecture Series, where Latino lives are transformed through education. Today, we have a very special guest to discuss the state of the very lives that we are trying to transform. We only need to surf the internet, look at the list of political leaders, the doctors who treat us, the neighborhoods where we live, and the leaders of larger organizations to realize the disparities with Latinos. There are inequalities in our income, the jobs we hold, access to education, social justice, technology, and now the impact of COVID. Para discutir este tema tan importante para todos nosotros, tenemos con nosotros nada menos que a la ejecutiva de LULAC. Cindy, bienvenida a San Agustín College.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reyes González. Es un placer estar con ustedes.
Gracias. Cindy, it is also an honor for us for you to be with us. You are an inspiration for our students, for me, and for so many other people. You exemplify the Latino spirit, strong, determined, and compassionate. You have shown us que con mucho ganas todos nuestros sueños se pueden realizar. You have shown the world that as a Latina, you can achieve the American dream. Cindy, welcome again to St. Augustine College. We're glad to have you here.
Gracias por la invitación.
And before we get started with our main topic, I would like for you to tell us about your life journey. How is it that a young immigrant Latina came to be the executive leader of LULAC?
Dr. Reyes González, thank you so much for that question. And before jumping in, just a tremendous honor to be sharing this time with you, and a shout out to our LULAC members across the country who are the heart, el corazón of who LULAC is as a grassroots organization. They are the folks who live and work in our local communities and who, send me an email, call me, text me, Facebook me when there's an issue that's happening on the ground, where we provide that local support, that national support. And I just want to also just thank Dr. Ana Gil Garcia, who has been working really diligently with our higher education task force, as well as our education committee, making sure that we are communicating to the Biden-Harris administration key priority issues for our students, for our educators, and for individuals who serve in the academia and education arena. And so, I feel like we could speak all day, and I will flag for everyone that you may see a tear or some come out, because I think as we think of the journeys that all of us have walked, we know that it's not always a straight path. And a lot of times, Dr. Reyes González, in the different remarks that I make, I always include a Bible verse. I always allude to some verse in the Bible, and the one that I always say is that even when we walk through the valley, we must remember that there is something brighter at the end of that valley, and that we're walking through it. We're not meant to stay permanently in it. And what we've seen in the last 4 years in the U.S. is absolutely that our community has a heightened level of fear. And as an immigrant who, in fact, was brought to the U.S. undocumented. My parents, who, in the 80s, understood that Honduras was rapidly declining, could see the corruption, could see also the increase in crime, decided to make the journey to the U.S., Dr. Reyes González. And so at the tender age of 1, they brought me to the U.S. And like so many immigrants, they came looking for opportunities. They started in Los Angeles, California. And believe it or not, for our fun time on the weekends, what we would do is that we would pick up cans in the street of Los Angeles. And it wasn't until I was older, Dr. Reyes González, when you start thinking about the fact that the zip code that you live in does impact the opportunities that you have. But when you're a child, you don't understand poverty, right? You really don't understand how to contextualize it. We were very fortunate that, for family unit. We were able to live in a studio apartment, and I remember, my parents slept in the closet, and my brother and I slept on the sofa, and somehow we made it through, and I have really happy memories. But I also remember, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, that it was we had a concrete wall in front of our studio apartment because it was a high crime area, and that for us it was very normal to see police cops, to see sirens, to see people on the floor dying, because we lived in a really bad area. And it was really not only the move from Honduras to California, but my mom's wisdom, and also I would say her vision, that really drove her to look for better public schools. And she found out, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, while going to work on a public bus, that there were these great schools in Fairfax County, Virginia. And based on that conversation, my brave mother, who is 5 feet nothing, right, is chaparrita, pero una persona con una energía that matches no one else, moved us from California to Virginia. And I always share that I don't think my mom, until we got on the plate, understood that Virginia was all the way across the US. But, that decision from my parents completely changed, second decision, completely changed the lives, not only my life, but the life of my 3 brothers. My older brother went into the US Marine Corps, has served this country in various tours in Iraq. The 2 younger ones went on to college. And so all of the children, one, are serving our country and or are college educated. And never in my wildest dreams, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, would have I imagined that I would be leading the oldest and largest national Latino civil rights organization in the country. And something that we take for granted oftentimes is this pioneering spirit that our parents bring with us, but this spirit of service to our community, of service and love to our families. And how many of us grew up in that household where the kitchen door or the front door was always open? Right? Everyone was welcome, no matter if we knew them or did not know them. And that's the family that I grew up in. I grew up in a family when, if there was a death, whether it was here in the US or if it was in Honduras, everyone rallied around to provide financial support and relief, whether we knew the person or if we did not. We just knew that we needed to help. And so, I continue in that tradition from my parents, in that tradition from both my maternal and paternal grandmother, in serving my community. But Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, if you had asked me even 10 years ago that I would be doing this, I probably would have smiled, but I don't know that I would have wholeheartedly believed what you would have said.
What a remarkable story. And it reminds me of a story of guerreras. And you spoke certainly about the journey of so many Latinos, and you were able to achieve those dreams that perhaps when you were a little girl you were not thinking about or dreaming that you would achieve what you have achieved. But certainly through the influence of your parents, you were able to become in part who you are. You mentioned something also that St. Augustine believes, and that is that breaking the cycle of poverty. Tell me more about how your views, or you mentioned that you didn't realize that you were poor when you were young, but nevertheless, it seems to me that it did influence you throughout your life, as it does many of us.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez. And first I have to say that words matter. And my abuelita, Zoila America, would always call me her princesita, but because I was tremenda, which means curious, aka curious, she would also call me her guerrera. And so, just, thinking also of the words that we call our children or siblings or other children and how powerful they are, because really what I do every single day is to wake up to protect and defend our Latino community in the US, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. And so in a way, I am a guerrera every single day. I do it with a smile. I do it with a lot of love in my heart. But know that, the mission of the organization, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, is always at the forefront in terms of how do we advance. And, as we are tackling so many issues, and boy, in 2020 was not only the global pandemic, and, for the Latino community, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, all of us at this point either know someone that has had COVID-19 or someone that has passed away from COVID-19. And what a lot of individuals don't understand is that 5 in 6 Latinos have to leave their houses every single day to work and get paid. The fruits and vegetables are not going to get picked on their own. People have to physically actually go into the field to be able to pick them. When we look at slaughterhouses at meatpacking industry, you need physical laborers, workers to be there, to be able to process, to cut, to package the meat, the pork, the chicken that some of us eat. And, when we look at other industries, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, we're also overrepresented in the grocery store industry, where 1/4 of all grocery store workers. We're in the health industry, whether it's as technicians, as janitors, as doctors, as nurses, as administrators. We're absolutely present as well as in the health industry. And, as we think of 2020, the global pandemic, COVID-19, wow, right? The issues that we have to tackle in terms of health access, in terms of what we're seeing in pre-existing conditions in the Latino community, whether it's morbidity rate, whether it's diabetes, or whether it's other conditions that are really high and prevalent in communities of color. Not to mention, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, that when you start measuring wealth in the Latino community, how far have we come since the civil rights movement of the 1960s? And this is not only true for the Latino community, but also for the African American community. And as financial experts start looking at that specific question, we know that instead of moving forward, we're moving backwards. And right now, in the middle of this pandemic, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, so many in our community have lost their jobs because they've been furloughed without paid. So many in our communities are unemployed because the business of employment has shut down, or their own business, unfortunately, was forced to shut down. So many in our community are not getting hired back at the rate of others. But even before looking at this pandemic, we already knew that Latinas, for example, had the biggest gap in pay. Latinas make 53 cents to the dollar of what a white Caucasian male counterpart makes doing the same exact job. We also know that, LULAC as an organization has been fighting for the minimum wage, $15. And even at $15, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, we know that that's still not going to be enough if our family units live in a high cost city. I mean, like, imagine to purchase a home in San Francisco. It's almost unreachable for so many of us because the cost of housing is so high. And it's similar in other cities like Nueva York, as well as cities in the Midwest. And so I think, to your question about income inequality, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, I don't think it's something that's necessarily taught in our schools, right? It's not integrated into the curriculum. I think we're fortunate at times that we're able to learn about Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage Month. And, if we can just even stop and pause for us to reflect of who are the Latino leaders, who are the Latino civil rights leaders, not only of the 1960s, but before that and after, right? It tells you about the work that we have ahead, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, to make sure that we have more Latino writers writing our narratives, that we have more Latino administrators, supervisors, elected officials pushing so that our stories are included in the fabric of what is America and how we have contributed before the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, right? Folks forget that St. Augustine, 1585, is the oldest city in America and that it was established by the Spaniards, of whom many of us are descendants. And so we have to recognize that Latinos, Hispanics in America have a vibrant history, and it's interlinked and interconnected to who we are as a country.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more about the value that we bring to this country. And at times it is not recognized and valued by others. But tell me about, as you spoke about a lot about disparities and inequalities in the Latino community. Why do you think that continues to happen and especially here in what is supposed to be the greatest democracy in the country. But at times I think that we can question how democratic it is when some of the less fortunate are treated the way that they are. And there would be one question. The other question is, what message would you send to our legislators on what they can do to serve the community that elected them?
You know, as we think as the disparities, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, for one, it's not an issue that, you know, just appeared on the scene in 2020 when COVID-19 happened, right? Like, we know that disparity issues have existed since the founding of this country. But I think more than that, the fact is that, you know, when we think about the institutions that exist in America, the fact is that these institutions were not created with Latinos or other communities of color in mind. And let me just bring up education. And I bring it up because it's an issue that is close to my heart. It's also an issue that is a priority for LULAC since the very inception. And, you know, what a lot of folks don't know, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, is that, you know, before schools were integrated, LULAC was part of Mendez versus Westminster, which called for integration of schools in Orange County, California. And that case was used as a precedent to Brown versus Board of Education, which integrated all schools across the country. But why I bring up that specific example is because, again, these institutions, right, you had the Caucasian schools, you had the brown, quote unquote, schools, and you had the Mexican shacks, right? And by no means was the brown or the Mexican schools nearly to the level that the Caucasian schools were in terms of the structure, in terms of what they provided the children, in terms of books. And so for us, it's so important to point that, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, because as schools became integrated, we also saw that funding was taken out of our public schools because now you had children of color who was attending these schools. And what we've seen for the last 60 years is a Band-Aid approach to our education system. I think we're at a place and a time, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, where we have to reimagine and envision what a better public school system could look like. And we're thrilled and excited that we have a Secretary of Education nominee who is of Latino descent. Believe me, we are rejoicing and we will be fighting so that the Senate confirms him. I think to your second question, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, it's making sure that elected members, whether at the local, state, or federal, understand the importance of the Latino community. And, you know, something I did not mention is that my first job really was in political organizing campaigning. And since the early 2000s, you know, I have been communicating, saying, writing memos, all of the above to campaign decision makers, that the Latino community is not a monolith. And in fact, that we're so diverse, not only in age, gender, religion, sexuality, nationality, what state we live in, all of these factors, including social income and level of education, matter as voters. And a Hispanic in New Mexico is very different from a Latino in Florida, from a Texan, Latino Texan in Texas, from a Chicano in the Midwest, and all the above, right? And I think, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, as elected officials are settling into their positions, we know some of them are a few weeks in, some of them after the Georgia runoff are still getting their feet wet, that the future of this country absolutely is Latino. And the fact is that in just 3 decades, 30 years, 3 decades, that means that my 5-year-old will be about 35 and my 3-year-old will be 33. Let me make sure I do my math correctly. In 3 decades, 30 years, 1 in 3 Americans will be of Latino ancestry. 1 in 5 today, in just 30 years, 1 in 3. And so as elected officials, corporations, institutions are thinking of diversity, equity, and inclusion, You better believe that as we look at the numbers today, there's a lot of catch-up work that needs to happen, because even today, when you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in America, we're not even in the double digits when it comes to the Latino community, right? Which means that we have to have even more aggressive measures to make sure that our Latino community is included. And if that means that today we have to build that pipeline that may take 30 years, so that in 30 years we have 4-star generals in our military that come of Latino ancestry, then that means we build it today. And so, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, this is an issue that I'm absolutely passionate about. Representation absolutely matters. And for all our Latino community and everyone who turned out to vote, thank you, because you participated in our democracy, regardless of your party, whether Republican, Independent, or Democrat. The fact that we live in a country, in a nation, where we're able to freely cast our vote matters. And as a Latino community and as a Latina, thank you to my Latino community for making sure you were registered, for making sure to turn out, and for also turning out early, right? We saw record numbers of Latinos turning out to vote early and voting by mail.
Sandy, that is remarkable. You in part already answered part of the question that I'm going to ask you, but you mentioned that in 3 decades, 1 of every 3 residents in the United States are going to have a Latino heritage. What are we going to do to make sure that 1 of every 3 elected officials are of a Latino descendants? How are we going to make sure that 1 of every 3 doctors, 1 of every 3 teachers, 1 of every 3 CEOs of the Fortune 500 are Latinos? Because it would make sense to me that if 30% of the country are Latinos, perhaps 30% of the leaders in this country should be Latinos. So give me your insight. I just love the way that you're thinking and your background.
Well, with the incoming Biden-Harris administration, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, LULAC was a part of Proyecto 20%, right? So understanding that currently the Latino community is about 20% of the total US population. And so, the fact that we have been absolutely pushing and advocating for more Latino representation tells you that it's important that we raise our voice and that we communicate the issues very loud and very clearly. And so we're very happy to see the nomination of Ali Mayorkas, the nomination of Javier Becerra, and of so many others who will be serving at the highest level, cabinet level, SBA, Don Graves, who's Afro-Latino at Commerce, deputy there. We're so thrilled that we're seeing that representation of Latino, one of the most diverse cabinets in the history of the US, right? Seeing a lot of firsts happening with the Biden administration. But no, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, it does not happen by us sitting calmly at our office and not sending letters, making calls, sending out social media tweets.
Guerreros y guerreras.
Absolutely, all the time and all the way. And it reminds me of Dolores Huerta, who is one of our civil rights leaders, and a person that I've had the pleasure to meet on so many different occasions, who has more energy than I do and can stay up later than I can, because I have seen her in action. But every single one of us is an organizer ready to take action, right? All of us have the ability to contact our members of Congress. All of us have the ability to speak on the issue that's important to each one of us. And so, as I mentioned, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, the issue of representation is huge for me, not only because in my own journey and career, I've always been the youngest in the room and typically the only Latina in the room. And, for me, making sure that our Latino community is represented is absolutely a priority. And so LULAC is also a part of Latino Voices for Boardroom Equity. And, the example that I have for you is that out in California, there was a state bill that passed that called for gender equity. In a state like California, where, the population is almost 40% Latino, of the 511 seats that opened up for women, only 17 seats went to Latinas. And that to me is disgraceful, right? That means that our decision makers are still not understanding the long term and the big picture of what it means to be represented. And so we had to follow up with SB 979, which called for corporations headquartered in California to have at least one ethnic minority. And so we are pushing hard through Latino Voices for Boardroom Equity, calling attention to Fortune 1000 companies, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, who profit from the Latino community, market to the Latino community, but don't have any Latinos on in their boards. And so for us, we know that being silent is not an option. We know that when we're silent, it means that there is no problem. And so for us, calling attention to these companies that we are watching, that we are paying attention, that we will be monitoring them and holding them accountable for their actions is very important. And, as we think of the Latino community, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, gosh, we forget the power that we have as the largest ethnic minority growing powerhouse in the US, right? If we could be a country, we would be India. And, so many of us forget not only the influence that we have in our own families and our own communities, but our consumer purchasing power, right? The truth is that we can decide if we're going to buy from one brand or not buy from one brand. Now, I will tell you that Latinos are absolutely loyal customers, but I think as we continue to understand the nuances of how we flex our political muscle, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, we understand that, whether we're spending $1 or $100,000, that it's coming from our pockets, right? That it's coming from work that we've done, and that all of that contributes to the American economy and the fabric of who we are as a country globally. The other thing to mention, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, and yes, we are a beautiful people, and yes, America absolutely will benefit because we are not only multicultural, we're multilingual. And the fact that we already bring these global experiences to a growing global economy, I think also helps to position the United States as a country globally. We're able to do trade and do business with countries because we have already people inside of the US who culturally understand, who speak the language, and who understand how business is done abroad. And so, as we think of all the layers of how Latinos contribute, of how we push for representation, we also have to understand that we can't box ourselves, right? So yes, absolutely always delighted when we have, agencies where Latinos are directly impacted, but we also want to see Latinos represented at the Department of Justice. We also want to see more Latinos as sheriffs. We also want to see more Latinos leading institutions of higher education like yourself, because you truly are san contaditos, right? Like we can almost count you in maybe two hands how many Latino presidents of universities we have in the country, right? Which is, again, a disgrace as you think about the incoming population of students. Also thinking of tenure professors. And I know that Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, our higher education task force, and we're so happy to have the leadership of Dr. Angela Valenzuela and Dr. Teresa Montaño, along with Dr. Ana Gil Garcia, really leading the way there in terms of thinking thoughtfully and strategically. What do we need to do? And one of the things that we need to learn and do is that data matters. So if the data does not exist, if we're not tracking how many presidents for higher education institutions are of Latino or other ethnic minority descent, then how do we know to create those changes? Or are we tracking how many tenure Latinos exist in higher education institutions and the promotion rates? And so if we don't have that data, we can't change it. And so what I tell folks oftentimes is that data drives policy. And so we have to really think thoughtfully and look at the bigger picture and start going, literally peeling the onion to go at the core of the issue and the problem, to be able to create those long-term sensible solutions that will create the impact that we want to have. But I would say the top thing, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, no nos podemos quedar en silencio. We have to speak up. If we don't speak up, it's not an issue, it's not a problem. And so it will literally take all of us to bring up these issues. And then the last thing that I would say is that, I have never met someone who grew up in a household where their parent told them, hijo, mija, when you grow up, I want you to be a politician. I have yet to meet that person. And I think we need to think about elected office as a career, and we need to start changing the narrative of what it means to run for office. You know, it means that we can be at the table creating the solutions for our community, and that we are worthy of those positions because we understand the realities that our communities face every single day, because we too face those realities along with them.
Yes, I agree with you and with everything that you said. And you also got me thinking about the role of higher education, um, and how we need to change our curriculum, and so that we can provide that type of mindset to our students, to Latino students, que sí se puede. We must open up our horizons so that we are no longer confined to the jobs that our parents and other siblings have occupied over the years, but that we can be that politician, we can be that doctor, that attorney, that legislator. And I think that you have shown us and showed many people that it is possible for someone like yourself, a 1 year old that came from Honduras, that struggled as an immigrant to the United States, and you are the CEO of the largest advocate for Latinos in the country. And that's a huge accomplishment for someone that uh, has been here a relatively short period of time. So I think that those of us that work in higher education also have an obligation to our community. So thank you for reminding us. Um, you know, I can't stop to think about how COVID has impacted Latinos. And once again, I think that part of the solution, of course, is with us, but also part of the solution is with our legislator. What message would you like to send to our legislators as to what they need to do to help our many people that are unemployed right now and they're struggling, and just lives are very difficult for them. It was difficult before COVID came around. Now that's just exacerbated the problem many times.
And you know what I would say, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, and you know, especially for our students who are, you know, listening in, that oftentimes we are the biggest barriers to our own growth. And you know, that can be because of different reasons. You know, oftentimes, you know, we forget, and I just want us to imagine a little baby, whether that's ourselves, a sibling, or our own child. And when you look at that face of that baby, they're born successful, they're born happy, they're born intelligent. And we know that life happens along the way, and that our journeys are so vastly different, and that it marks us as individuals. But I want us to really push ourselves to be uncomfortable. And you know, in the Latino community, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, we come from a community that's so humble, a community that does so much without asking for anything, a community that is pioneering, that has an entrepreneur spirit, a community that is hardworking. And I absolutely get my, unfortunately, long hours of work ethic from my father and mother, a community that is so giving. And so, you know, I want us to continuously push ourselves and push our own boundaries and be uncomfortable. And, you know, I oftentimes hear Dr. Reyes Gonzalez that so many in our community feel like they don't belong, right? Because they're also hearing this narrative that they don't belong here. And, you know, a lot of times I have to explain that Latinos are not immigrants. We were here before Colorado was Colorado. We were here before New Mexico was, or Nuevo Mexico was New Mexico, right?
Mhm.
We were here long before Texas, Tejas was Texas.
Mhm.
And, you know, we have to understand, and we have to take a step back to unlearn what we have learned and relearn our own history so we can be even more proud of our roots and our ancestry. And, you know, as we think of the challenges that our community is facing, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, you know, this past 2020 has been a hard one for our community. You know, my heart is absolutely with all the families who have lost someone due to COVID-19. My heart is to all those individuals who have seen their parents lose their jobs, and now they've had to step up to the plate and take another job or two jobs to help offset that income in their families. My heart is with all the older siblings who, as their parents went to work, they were in charge of the younger siblings so they could go to school and they could be on top of their school. And yet we still see an increase in failure and Fs that our children are receiving. And I think as we speak and as we think of elected officials and people who are in decision-making positions, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, my biggest recommendation, and I have said this directly at all levels, whether it's the Biden transition team, whether it's at the CDC, NIH, you name it, governors, mayors, I've communicated this, is that we have to meet our community where they are. And we have to make sure that, if we're creating a beautiful website, we have to know that 1/3 of Latinos don't have access to technology or broadband. And so innately, even if, with the best of intentions, you're going to miss 1/3 of Latinos because they don't have access to technology and broadband. And then you add the just compounding of the fact that you have Latinos who are in rural America and who may be working jobs that are from dawn till dusk. And when they come home, the last thing that they're thinking about is, how do I check a website to get more information? And so, as I speak to different leaders, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, and I will tell you that, at the very beginning of this pandemic in March of 2020, when we reached out to the CDC to ask for information in Spanish, understanding, and I'm going to make a huge asterisk here, that there's a segment within the Latino community that's Spanish dominant because the majority of Latinos are English dominant. The CDC's response was, we don't have the information and we don't know when we're going to have it. And so as a nonprofit, right, and I can tell you probably our nonprofit budget compared to the government's budget, there's probably like $1 trillion of a gap in there of those budgets, right? But we immediately pivoted, understanding that us, the nonprofits at the national level, at the local level, was all that our community had, along with some of the local and state governments that stepped up to the plate and who understood that they needed to invest and make sure that this information was relevant in the language and culturally appropriate for our community. And so we ended up, creating something called Ayuda en Español. It doesn't sound brilliant, but I mean, it's very direct, right? It's help in Spanish, right? Like it's Ayuda en Español, because we thought, what, our community does have smartphones. They most likely will Google it, will search it, and this is potentially what could come up in it. And, in the middle of traveling through this dark valley, the bright star, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, is that creativity, comes to us very innately. And we were able to create a toolkit that has been used by hundreds of thousands in our community to access resources, not only along, food insecurity and knowing where their local food bank is, but is there financial relief at the local and state level? If I'm experiencing domestic violence, where do I go? What are some resources that my children can access? And so for us, it was understanding that it was the wraparound services, right? That our community wasn't just one issue that was impacting them, that it was multiple issues. And so we immediately jumped into action. I am not a professional interpreter nor translator, but you better believe that I became a translator overnight because the necessity of the community mandated it. And we were fortunate that many of our corporations stepped in and said, Cindy, you don't have to do it. We have, third-party vendors who are consultants, who are professionals and can help you do this. And so we were able to scale at a level that we had never seen, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, and reach hundreds of thousands of people. And on top of that, we had corporations who were seeing our good work, not only around COVID-19, but also around the case of soldier Vanessa Guillen, and going after the military when one of our own soldier dies on our military bases. And, these companies stepped up to the plate and said, we want to help our community when it comes to food insecurity and providing financial relief. And since then, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, it's been nonstop. If you see the ojeras under my eyes, is because, even during the holiday break, we weren't able to take that break because we knew that that was, one of the hardest times for our community when so many are unemployed. And as we think of the future, and who comes to mind is our small businesses. What we learned from our entrepreneurs and doing surveys in August and September of last year is that our Latino small businesses were not prepared. They did not have the infrastructure ready to be able to apply for the PPP loans. And simple things like having a business account versus a personal checkings account, right? Believe it or not, we have to make sure that we are providing that awareness and education for our community, whether they're individuals or whether they're businesses. And the next big hurdle, I would say, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, is the vaccine. And we already know, right? This is a known fact that Latinos are being targeted with an anti-vaccine disinformation campaign. So many in our community are already getting videos, whether they're made in the US or they're made abroad, that say that they should not get the vaccine because they're going to get X side effects, or because this is a way for the government to manipulate them, or because of really interesting conspiracy theories. And so we have to push against that, because again, it is our community who is dying. Right now we have the highest percentage of hospitalizations rate in the country. We also still have a high level of positivity rate across the country. And so for us, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, is continuing to beat the drum, continuing to advocate, but also make sure that our community understands how powerful their voice is, right? And that they should not be fearful to reach out to their local county government official, or to reach out to their Congress member, whether it's a representative or a US senator. And one day we will have a president whose last name is Benavides or Garcia or Gonzalez, and they will be of Latino origin and ancestry. And that day is coming pretty soon, because I know so many of us in the background, regardless of political party, are working to make sure that we have those candidates who are ready. And we saw a couple in the last cycle, but we're excited, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, for what the future holds, but we also have to acknowledge the reality that our communities are facing.
Yes, it's wonderful. But I would hope and pray que será presidenta, no solamente presidente de los Estados Unidos. So the other thing that I want to mention, I think that you were describing about who we are as a community. We are entrepreneurs, we are innovators, we are creative, even from the person that pushes the tamales cart down the street. He or she is an entrepreneur. If you go to our countries, we fix our automobiles with a coat hanger. Not many other ethnic groups can do that. And it's all about innovation and creativity and finding solutions. And that's who we are as a community. But would you think that we are also perhaps a little bit too quiet? Or what would you say about us as a community? Or do we think that we say enough, speak enough?
That's an interesting question. And, I would say my first reflection would be that we have to remember the history of the US, right? And for, many Latinos and Hispanic who are multiple generation American, that they've lived through decades of oppression, right? And, I'm remembering so many of our LULAC members from Texas who always share their stories that, when they used to go to school, and if they dare say, said a word in Spanish, they would be hit by with a rule, right? For speaking the language that they spoke at home. And I also think, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, and I know that as we look at the future of America, that culturally, I was always taught to be calladita me miro más bonita, but for some reason that
I
phrase,
you calladita, by the way.
that phrase completely skipped me, and I know that at times my mom wonders what happened to her daughter.
That's not a word that I would choose to describe you.
Thank you. And so, for those who don't speak Spanish, my mom used to say, quiet, I look more beautiful. And it was just culturally, always be, paying respect to our elders, right? And listening to others. Unfortunately, my parents gave birth to a very opinionated child. And although I am an introvert at heart and I've had to work on public speaking, I will tell you that when I see an injustice, it's so close to my heart that it's hard for me to stay quiet. And so I'm absolutely doing the right job and doing something that I love, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez. But I think so many in our community are taught to be silent. And we also have to remember that there are many in our community who are undocumented or who live in mixed status families. And because what we've seen happen in the last few years, where immigrants have been persecuted in America, whether it's the Muslim ban or whether it's because of your ethnicity. And let's remember the shooting that happened in El Paso, where for so many of us, our ethnicity was used as a weapon against us. And we have to understand those dynamics that have been occurring in America, where so many white supremacists have literally come out to be very outspoken and very public about the racist and xenophobic views that they hold in terms of this country being taken away from them, when in fact we have always been a part of this country. And so, part of my job, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, and what I aspire to do long term is to harness that advocacy and political potential from our community. And we know we have to ask, right? We know that for a Latino and a Latina to run for office, especially for women, you have to ask multiple times and even more times for a Latina to run for office. I think it's important, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, that we recognize that we ourselves have to also break our own mental and mindset oppressions that we have and that we've been brought up with. And, I didn't start questioning our history books. I didn't start questioning what I had learned until I had the privilege to go to a historical Black college. And at that college, I had Professor Gary Baker, who would say, well, Cindy, why are you reading this book? Do you even know who the author is? And, when we start talking about inclusion at a historical Black college, he would push us and press us and say, Cindy, who comes to eat at your dinner table? And do they reflect the community that you live in? Right? And that's so important, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, because sometimes we ourselves also seclude ourselves from others, right? And I just want us to remember like our days back in high school when, like the Latino kids sat with the Latino kids, and then you had like the African American table, and then you had the Asian American table, and then you had like the cool table. And, like we have to understand that we have to really traverse across, our own way of separating ourselves, us versus the other, and think in a completely different narrative and frame mind of how we work in allyship, how we make sure that just as we're talking about COVID-19 impacting the Latino community, that disproportionate and even higher impact it's had on Native American communities, that we think about the issues as it impacts us, all of us. And so many in the community know that I am passionate about creating a national Black and brown agenda and bringing all of our communities of color together, because in numbers there is power. And when you look at all of these combined numbers, we are the new majority. And a lot of the issues, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's representation, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's economic impact, all of these issues impact all of us in a very, very similar way. I will acknowledge, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, that obviously with every constituency group, with every ethnic community, we have different histories, and we can't own the history that has occurred to our Native American community nor our African American community, but we can support them in their struggle, because it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said that a civil rights violation to anyone is a civil rights violation to everyone. And so we have to understand that when X person or X government is persecuting a community, that's just the beginning. Who is coming next? And we have to absolutely be loud, be clear, and make sure that we're standing against injustice and taking action. It's not enough to put out a tweet. It's not enough to put a social, to put something on your Facebook. You actually do have to contact your member of Congress. You actually do have to write. You actually at some point have to walk into that office and meet with them face to face so that they can see what a Latino face or Latina face looks like. And by the way, we don't look alike, right? We are very, very, very diverse. And so I would say, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, we have some work to do internally, but I think it's also making sure we understand the history of oppression that our community has faced in America.
Yes, I would add to the list of things that we need to change, and that is that you mentioned one of our leaders that I also admire. His dream has not been fulfilled, and neither has ours. I would also add to the things that we need to change is that our children cannot continue living in poverty. Our adults cannot continue to be incarcerated. We need to change the narrative, and we need to change the narrative not only that we're invited to dinner to have the main dish, but also not to serve it. We need to change. We need to invite it for dinner and not to serve dinner. So there's so much that we can discuss, and there's so much to talk about Latinos. Our time is coming to an end, and I am very sorry. I hope that we have an opportunity to continue our discussion. Is there a thought or an advice that you would like to leave our audience with?
As I think of that question, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, first and foremost, it has been a pleasure. And, typically I'm sharing everything about, what we're fighting or protecting or defending at the moment, and less about me, which is actually how I like it. But I think on a personal note, something that I've come to learn is that with every decision that we make, we're either walking towards love or we're walking towards fear. And we have to be very intentional. We have to check our own mindset. We have to check, our own thoughts in terms of what we may be perceiving and the reasons why, certain feelings arise. And, absolutely understand that unconscious bias exists in every single one of us, and that it takes a lot of work internally to do that work. I would also tell you, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, that, the issue of racism is very close to my heart. And part of it is because I have seen what colorism looks like and what anti-Blackness looks like, and fought it even within my own family. My children are both Latino and African American. And, as I think of issues that will continue to evolve in America, the fact is that Latinas are one of the groups that marries at a higher percentage rate outside of our own ethnic group. And so America will continue to blend. And, for us, it's so important that we think thoughtfully of the future of America and what the dream fulfilled could look like. And whether that is that regardless of the zip code that you grow up in, you have equal opportunity and access. That's the America that we dream of. Or whether that's making sure that regardless of your income, you have access to healthcare. That's the America that we dream of. And we have to be able to dream beyond our current realities and beyond our current circumstances, and understand that at times we may be called radical, at times we may be even called a little out there, but you know what? It's okay, because we have to be able to think beyond ourselves to create the future that we want to see for our children and for ourselves, hopefully, right? We don't know if it's going to happen. I would say, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, that we absolutely need more of us to run for office. And so if you've never been asked, if you have never even thought about it, I'm asking you, run for office. We need you, whether that's running for Attorney General, or whether that's running for the local education school board, or maybe it's running for a local position in your university campus. Run for office. If you're an introvert like me, you can do it. You can break out of that shell. I promise you. It took me years, but you absolutely can do it. And also that, you should look at how you define leadership. And oftentimes, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, what is not brought up is the challenges that we faced. And, typically because I was the youngest, the Latina, the only woman in the room, folks discarded my opinions because, ¿qué va a saber esta muchachita? Acabada de nacer, right? Like they literally, I have heard those words. And, what I brought to the table was that I understood my community. I have hyper empathy. I'm strongly connected to community members, and I pay attention to what our LULAC members have to say, whether they're in Puerto Rico, Texas, Washington State, or the Midwest. It's so important that we bring ourselves to the table and understand what we're bringing to the table, so that others cannot disregard our own opinions and disregard what we're saying. It's also so important that you give it all that you got. And the truth is, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, is that oftentimes we have to be close to perfect, right? And executing everything that we do because we're simply graded differently in some instances, right? There's so many higher expectations, not only from ourselves, but from others in terms of how we execute. And so particularly for our students who are listening in, I understand that these are challenging times. I understand that, there's so much uncertainty, but the truth is that in the future that is America, we need you at that table, whether it's creating policy as policymakers or being in academia and making sure that we have more tenured professors who are Latinos, or making sure that the curriculum is completely changed so that it includes our stories and histories, or making sure that you're writing, right, and sharing that narrative globally of who Latinos in America are. And so I will end it, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, with a heart full of gratitude, and thank everyone for all that you do every single day, because it's truly all of you, our local heroes, who make things happen at the ground level. And just a huge shout out to our LULACers who are tuning in for all that you do every single day, because you are the heart. You are the corazón de esta organización, and LULAC is what it is because of the work that you do. And if it wasn't because of you, we wouldn't be celebrating 92 years on February 17th this year. So thank you.
Cindy, congratulations. I am going to take your advice very seriously, but I would like to see you to continue to grow because we need you to continue your journey of leadership. So thank you very much. You have enriched my life because I have learned so much from you. This is your home, and I hope that you will consider visiting us soon when the pandemic is over, because we here dedicate our lives to transforming Latinos through knowledge. I invite the audience for our next series that I'm sure they will have another leader, another Latina leader, just like Cindy. Cindy, mil gracias.
Thank you, Dr. Reyes Gonzalez, and thank you for the invitation. And you can find me at lulac.org. Click on my picture, it will take you to my email, and always, always happy to be of service. Gracias.
Gracias.